Hey, Redeeming Hope. Thank you guys so much for tuning into our online gathering. We're so glad you guys are joining us today. In this time of social distancing, I really would prefer that we call it physical distancing. We really want to stay relationally connected. So if you are on social media right now, if you could just hit like, comment, let us know where you're joining us from, and hit share. And if you're actually tuning in on our website, if you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, just pull up your cell phone. If you have a Facebook account, if you could just go on and just share this video with your friends. We love the vision of our church. We love Clarksville, and we really want to spread the word out that we're here and we're doing this, and that would be a huge help to us. And as I was mentioning before, the vision of our church, we love it, and it's this. See, Redeeming Hope, we exist as a family of faith that follows Jesus and helps others find him by living all of life as missionaries of hope. This means that we want to be a family, but we also want to be a family that's super open to anybody, regardless of their spiritual background, regardless of where they are on their spiritual journey, and to kind of help guide our church family into creating a really open space for anybody to join us. We have 4 disclaimers that pretty much guide everything we do as a church, and those are these: that if you're joining us and you do not identify as a follower of Jesus, you're welcome here. If you don't believe the Bible is true, you're welcome here. If you're hurting, you're welcome here. And if you have questions, you're welcome here. And if you do have questions, if you're watching us on a Sunday morning at 11 a.m. Central Time, we do a live Q&A that discusses the things that we talk about here during our message time. So there's many different ways that you can join us on our website, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, Periscope, all those different ways. Essentially, wherever you're viewing this, just stay there and you'll be able to join us from there. Also, if you would like to give back to God what he's given to you through giving to the local church, we would love to encourage you to do that. You can go on our website, redeeminghope.org/give. You can also find us on Venmo at Redeeming Hope. All your gifts are tax deductible. We send out a tax deductible receipt at the end of the year. Thank you guys so much for your faithfulness in giving. Actually, we've seen an uptick in giving since our quarantine and COVID-19, and that's because many of you are just really being very generous with your time and with your finances. I just want to thank you guys so much for doing that. And again, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Our text today is in Luke chapter 20, and Jesus is in Jerusalem, and I'm really excited to share with you what God's been sharing with me this week, although it has been a very difficult week for many of us, as we will talk about here in a second. We're in Luke 20, starting in verse 19. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on Jesus at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies and who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality, but truly teach us the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" But he, Jesus, perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?" They said, "Caesar's." He said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." And they were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent. This is God's word. So my friends, this week, many of us were horrified to learn of the tragic suffering and death of George Floyd. And just yesterday morning, I joined leaders from our city to come together for a time of repentance and mourning, lamentation and reconciliation. And there's about 100 people that were on the steps of our city's government, and the mayors were kind enough to let the pastors use it. I was able to offer up a prayer as well, and we were just spending this time together mourning what has happened in our country this week. And I shared earlier this week on Facebook Live that every human being is made in God's image, and it's God's breath that gives us life. It's God's breath that allows us to breathe and have life and to live life. See, George Floyd's death was taken from him this week. And we see that this is not how it's supposed to be in the world around us. And what's really interesting, and I mentioned this earlier at our Wednesday Bible study, is that we were slated this week to literally talk about the image of God. The title of the sermon is "You Are Made in God's Image," and we had developed this title back in January. So God, again, is continuing to show us that he has been in our sermon series prep, and we really need to talk about this after the week that our country, that our nation has had. So our main point for today is this, that every human being is made in the image of God, created with infinite value, and then invited to give our lives back to the ultimate image bearer, Jesus, to be restored and renewed. So let me bring us to the text, and then we're going to come back to this George Floyd tragedy later on as we discuss the image of God and man. But where we've seen Jesus is that Jesus has been on the route to Jerusalem. And he is now in Jerusalem. He's in the final stages of his ministry. He's preparing to suffer and die. And these are his last weeks teaching, and we see this increased tension with the scribes, the Pharisees, with the religious elite. See, when Jesus comes into town, he drives out the ruling class from the temple. They were taking advantage of the people financially. And so Jesus drives them out. And it says at the end of chapter 19 that they were seeking to destroy Jesus. And in chapter 20, right before our text today, Jesus shares a parable. He shares a parable about how God is going to come and judge those who have been taking advantage and oppressing his people. And in fact, right before we get to this text that we read this morning, it says that God will destroy and crush those who are taking advantage of his people. Those who are meant to protect and shepherd and guide the people, the religious elite of the day, were in fact brutally taking advantage of them, even as the Romans are taking advantage of the Jewish people as well. And so this is a direct confrontation. And so that's where we enter into the story. Jesus is in Jerusalem, having this tension back and forth. He just told a parable, and this is what we see in verse 19. The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour. They were angry with him, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. They knew that he had told this parable against them, but they were fearing the people. So they watched him. They sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So we see the chief priests, the religious elite of the day, they're resorting to trickery and deceit. And this is the context for the challenge that we see in verses 21 through 23. So this is not a genuine, sincere question like we've seen elsewhere in the book of Luke. He's giving us a little insight into that these people, they're not directly from the chief priests and scribes, but they're sent by them, and they're trying to trick Jesus. And so they asked him, and this is Luke 20, verses 21 to 22, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly and show no partiality. How ironic is it that they're saying these things, which are actually true, but they're saying it in sarcasm in front of the people. They didn't quite know how true their words really were. But truly teach us the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?" And that's where we come into our text today. They're asking Jesus this question: is it lawful to give taxes to Caesar or not? And just a reminder of our main point for today, because I want to make sure this is on the screen and in front of our eyes multiple times as we talk today. This is our main point for today, that every human being is made in the image of God, created with infinite value, and then invited to give our lives back to the ultimate image bearer, Jesus, to be restored and renewed. And so as we look at this text today, we're going to talk about 4 points. And the image of Caesar brings value. We're going to see the image of God brings infinite value. We're going to see that the image of God is perfected in Jesus. And finally, we're going to see that the image of God is an invitation home. So let's look at how the image of Caesar brings value. So they're asking this question: is it lawful? This is Luke 10:22. Luke 20:22. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? So we actually talked about this idea of taxing last week as we looked at the story of Zacchaeus. And it was really, truly considered a blasphemy against God to be paying taxes to their Roman oppressors. They're paying tribute to them. And they have to, or else they're going to be completely and utterly destroyed. So they're in this really, really difficult situation where they're giving money, they're supposed to be giving money back to God. They're supposed to be tithing to God. And really now they're being forced to give an exorbitant amount of their money to the Roman government as tribute to keep them from being killed and completely destroyed as a people. So this was a very emotionally charged issue for a first century Jewish person. And to be clear, the tax that they're talking about here is not referencing what we talked about last week. So Zacchaeus, what we're talking about last week, and the taxes that he would receive on behalf of the Roman government were taxes on imports and exports and sales tax, essentially. Market tax. But this was what was called a poll tax. So that literally means regardless of your age, regardless of your race, regardless of your economic status, your job, your position in society, every single person in all of Israel was charged one amount of money per person that they had to pay. And even more importantly than that, that this type of tax was given directly to Caesar. So it didn't go to the local provinces. It didn't go to like a general pot to like actually maybe fix the roads in Jerusalem or other things like that, that you could kind of justify tax for. This was going directly into the pocket of Caesar, and it was just really, really difficult for the people of Israel. It's an emotionally charged issue, like I said. So the reason why this is such a loaded question is they're kind of putting Jesus in a corner here. They're trying to. So if Jesus comes up and says, oh yeah, it's totally fine to pay taxes to Caesar. If he says, yes, it's fine to do that, then really Jesus will be seen as a betrayer of his people. He'll lose the trust because they're saying, hey, maybe he's in the pocket of the Romans. Maybe this famous Jewish leader, the Romans are kind of slipping him a little money on the side to lead us astray, to lead us into further subjugation to the Roman government. And really, if Jesus were to come out and say that in the culture of that day, they would have kind of rejected Jesus, and then the Jewish leaders would have been able to quietly slip in, kill Jesus without the crowds getting upset with them. Okay, so if Jesus says, yes, pay taxes to Caesar, he's seen as a betrayer of his people. Now, if Jesus comes out and says, no, it's not right to pay taxes to Caesar, then the Roman government will immediately consider him to be an insurrectionist. They will immediately consider him to be anti-government, and they'll put the kibosh on that real quick. I mean, they literally would try him and kill him same day. They had the authority and the ability to do that because they don't put up with anybody speaking out against the government. Of course, not like free speech as we mostly enjoy here in the United States. They would have put that down. Now that would have allowed the Jewish people to have turned Jesus into the authorities and said, hey, he said you can't pay taxes to Caesar. And it would have been the Romans that would have killed him, and it would have gotten the Jewish people off the hook. And in fact, they would have been able to even further goad the people to cling to them as the spiritual authority, because now this is just yet another reason to hate Rome, because they would have killed Jesus. So if Jesus says yes, he loses the crowd, and the Jewish people can kill Jesus pretty easily. If he says no, then the Romans would kill Jesus. So it seems like an impossible situation until we get to Luke 20, verses 23 to 24. But Jesus perceived their craftiness. He saw what they were doing. He saw through these people, and he said to them, show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have? And they said, Caesar's. And Jesus sees their trickery, and he responds absolutely masterfully to this. So he calls for a denarius. Now, I want to put a picture up on the screen of what a denarius is, okay? This is about 1 day's worth of wages. It was mostly pure silver. Actually, in fact, it had about 97 to 98% purity in it. And it was minted by the Roman government. It was a small piece of metal that was stamped. And actually, how it was stamped is actually going to come into play as we understand a little bit later the significance of the statement. So I want to show you another picture here. And this is how it was made. I know this might be a little bit of an interesting diagram, but I want you to just kind of follow it logically from the top to the bottom. So There's a hammer, there's what's called a punch, there's two different dies and a coin blank that goes in between. So you would essentially heat up this small round metal disc that was made mostly of silver, and it was called a planchet, right? A blank coin, and it would be placed in to this almost machine-like substance, and it was placed on an anvil with a metal die or a punch on each side, and they would actually fit perfectly together like two puzzle pieces when pressed together. And so essentially, if you press together and the metal is hot, someone would hit the punch and it would create a stamped image on both sides of this heated metal disc. They'd probably throw it in some water, and then boom, you've got a perfectly usable metal Roman denarius. And they literally made millions of these with the image of Tiberius, who's the emperor. So I want to show you Tiberius again. This is what it looks like. You can actually buy them on eBay. You can buy a Tiberius denarius. It was his likeness, his imprint on the metal that made it valuable. That's what made it currency, right? Now, the silver was somewhat valuable, but the fact that it was a denarius meant that it was incredibly valuable as currency, and without the image of Tiberius on it, it was not considered currency. And so this word likeness is pronounced icon in the Greek. That's actually how it's pronounced. And it's actually where we get our English word for icon. It means a representation, an example. So Tiberius's icon is what verified that the coin was legit. His image is what gives that piece of metal value as currency. So Jesus held up a coin, just like what we're looking at right now, and he was asking, and he asked those people who were trying to entrap him, whose icon is this? And they said, Caesar's. Now, my friends, let me tell you, this was brilliant of Jesus because he's actually getting them to acknowledge Roman sovereignty over Jewish currency. He's actually getting them. They want to actually go against Caesar. They want to go against the Roman government. And so what he says is, whose image is on this coin? And they have to acknowledge that it's Caesar's, that actually Caesar's image is what makes their money valuable. It's what makes their money able to be in the marketplace and to buy things. And it's a kind of expression of Roman dominance over the Jewish way of life. And so Jesus gets them to kind of admit that in front of the whole crowd to say, hey, look, as much as you want to, guess whose image is on this coin? It's Caesar's. And there ain't no getting around it. So Caesar's image is what gives this coin value. But we see that the image of God brings infinite value. This is where we get to the next point. So Jesus gets them to admit that Roman sovereignty is over them. And then look at what happens next. Look at Luke 20, verse 25. He said to them, then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And my friends, there are some very deep truths about our identity, about who we are and who God is. And that word render literally means to give up, to return, or to give back, kind of return to sender, right? If we want to use the Elvis terminology on our message today, it's return to sender, give it back, render. And essentially what he's saying is that give your money back to him. And this would have shocked the people. So he's actually not saying the taxes are right. He's not actually saying that it's just what Caesar is doing, but he says, hey, look, it's Caesar's money that's in it. And it's Roman money, so you might as well give it back to them, this metal image. But then Jesus truly makes a life-altering, life-transforming, reality-shifting statement that if you believe it could change your life. He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but then he says, render to God what is God's. What does he mean? My friends, in this comparison, Jesus is saying that you and I are the icon. You and I are the image. You and I are the likeness. You and I are the imprint of God himself. And it is God's imprint on us that gives us infinite worth and value. My friends, we are given infinite value because we are stamped, imprinted with the image of God in us. We have the very likeness of God on us. And Jesus is calling us to give up more than our money to him. He's calling us to give our very essence, our very lives back to God. And this is not a new thing that Jesus is introducing. This actually goes back to the very first pages of the Bible. So look with me at Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 26. This is what it says. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. My friends, that word image is selem in the Hebrew, and it literally means a representation or a copy of. That's what the word image means. But then the word likeness is demuth in the Hebrew, and that word is it means that something is similar, but it doesn't have the same substance. So it might have similar characteristics, but it's not the same exact thing. So what he's saying is there's a representation, but it's not a direct copy. And this actually comes into play very importantly because, again, we want to think like a first century Jewish person that's listening to these words of Jesus, processing through them. And I know we got 2,000 years of history that separate us, but in order to grasp the deep, beautiful truth of the scriptures, we have to kind of go back in time, if you will, to think about this. Now, in the Old Testament, when a king would conquer a nation, here's what he would do. He would build himself an effigy, a statue. And then you'd erect a statue and a bunch of smaller statues that would represent that, hey, I am the authority here. So it would literally be a physical representation of the king's presence and authority, even if the king wasn't physically there. And so this is how they'd make the statue. And again, it's similar to how they make the coins, but I think the details are important here. What they do is they take an original bust of a king, tiny thin piece of metal, and they'd wrap it around the bust, take a little hammer, and they'd begin to tap all around it. Okay? And as they tapped it, the image of that bust would come onto and around that piece of metal. So they'd be able to pull that piece of metal off, and hey, guess what? It'd look like the statue, right? That's how they would copy busts and metal icons and statues back then. Now, image and likeness in Genesis 1, they're working together. It's telling us that we're not an original carbon copy, but we are like God. We're not an exact copy. Look with me at Genesis 1:26 again. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. We're not just a copy of God. Mankind isn't just a copy, right? We're not little gods running around. But we are a likeness to God. You see, this is how I describe it. All of humanity is the visible bodily representative of the authority and the value of the invisible bodiless God. Let me say that again. All of humanity is the visible bodily representative of the authority and the value of the invisible bodiless God. My friends, we are given authority by God to rule and reign in the world in his stead. Look with me at verse 26 of Genesis 1. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. You see, out of the value of being made in God's image, we were created to carry the authority of a loving God to the world. See, we were created to care for creation. We were created to rule it and protect it. But more importantly, we were created to cause creation to flourish and thrive under our care. So when God placed Adam and Eve in the garden and he said, have dominion, it didn't mean like this conquesting type dominion. It meant a flourishing dominion. It meant that under the rule and reign of Adam and Eve, who were the representative of God's authority on the earth, like God causes things to flourish, so Adam and Eve were supposed to cause things to flourish. And the Bible has a word for that. And I've used it before, and I'll probably use it again. It's called shalom. It means peace. It means universal flourishing and connectedness. That's what we were supposed to steward. That's what humanity was supposed to be about. But unfortunately, we rebelled against God. And now we use our authority to bring hurt and harm and discord and brokenness into the world. You see, we were given infinite value because we are stamped and imprinted with the image of God. But we rebelled against God, and now we use our authority to bring evil and not goodness into the world. And you see, going back to George Floyd, that's why what happened this week is so appalling. That the authority of a police officer who gave an oath to protect and serve brought subjugation, he brought brokenness and death to an unarmed black man in the streets of Minneapolis. He destroyed George. And he destroyed an image bearer of God. And what authority was meant for the good, for the flourishing of a community, for the protection of community, it brought death and division. And the echoes of which are still being felt in our country today and probably will be felt for a long time. See, why is it so hard to look at that, though? Because I believe that we all intrinsically know that human beings are made with worth and dignity and value. Every human being deserves worth and dignity and value. See, the implications of being made in the image and the likeness of God are that we are all created with equal value and dignity in God's kingdom, because we're all filled with the same breath of God that filled Adam, that is passed on through the generations. We are created with equal value and dignity. See, we are all created and we all have worth and value because of God's image and imprint, his stamp on us. Because we're created in the image of God, this is why we have value. And we are called to usher justice and order and rightness into the world. That's our job as humans. That was our job from the garden. You see, when that dignity, when that image is violated by injustice, our hearts cry out that this is not the way it is supposed to be. When image bearers are destroyed, we know that this is not right. So how do we respond? Where is our hope? Because we're supposed to rule, we're supposed to protect, we're supposed to cause all of creation to flourish and thrive under our authority. And what we saw this week, and what we see every week in the news and in the mirror, is that doesn't happen. We don't do this. We don't cause our world to thrive. In fact, we cause our world to descend into decay. So where do we find our hope? And that's where we come into our third point, is that the image of God is perfected in Jesus. Because my friends, thanks be to God, this is not the end of our story. Our distortion of the image of God and our rebellion against his flourishing is not the end. Injustice is not the end of our story. Look with me at the book of Colossians. Look with me at Colossians 1, starting in verse 15. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God. He's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. See, we have infinite value because we are stamped and imprinted with the image of God. We rebelled against God, and now we use our authority to bring evil into the world. But Jesus restores the image of God in us. You see, where we have failed to rule in the world in rightness, Jesus succeeded. Jesus had perfect authority in the world, and he used it perfectly. You see, where we have caused destruction and distortion as God's image bearers, Jesus comes to bring healing and reconciliation of all image bearers back to himself. Where we have caused division and death with our authority, Jesus has brought peace and life with his authority. You see, that is the beautiful message of Jesus, that where Adam has failed, where you and I have failed, we then look to Jesus, who is our perfect image bearer. He did not rebel against his Father. He was faithful to his Father. He did not use his authority to create discord and division. He used his authority to bring reconciliation and hope, redemption, redeeming hope. That's what he did. And so when we see the brokenness in the world, our reflex, we need to teach our mind and teach our heart to reflex to see Jesus in the midst of it, to see Jesus as the perfect image bearer when we are not, when police officers who are supposed to administer justice and righteousness do the opposite. This should turn our hearts to look to Christ as our ultimate image bearer who did it perfectly. So my question is, how does that help us today? See, my friends, we don't just see Jesus from being afar as a perfect image bearer, but we are invited to be unified with him, and we are invited to be restored. Our image is invited to be restored by being unified with Jesus, the perfect image bearer. You see, the image of God perfected in Jesus is an invitation to come home. Look with me at Luke 20:25. Again, he said to them, "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The word render, again, it means to give up, to give back, to return to sender. You see, we are invited to come back home. We are invited to return back to God. As an image of Caesar can be given to him through the exchange of a coin, so the image of God can be given back to him through a true belief in Jesus to be restored and renewed by the ultimate image bearer, Jesus Christ. And so if you look back in the history of your relationship with God, and you can look to a moment in time where you can't see a moment in time where you genuinely said, "I give my life, I give my all to Jesus. Not only do I believe it intellectually, but I place my faith in Christ." This is an invitation to give your broken image back to God by faith in Jesus Christ. Mark 1:15, which I share quite a bit here, and I will continue to share quite a bit at our church, is when Jesus says, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel." See, my friends, this is the invitation of the image bearer, but it's also the choice of the image bearer. You see, as image bearers, as made in the likeness of God, we can choose whether or not we come back to God to receive our identity and our restoration from him, or we can choose to reject him. And whereas most people see hell as, especially those who I've talked to quite recently here in Clarksville, hell is a challenge for a lot of people, because they see hell as this angry God that just wants to pour out his wrath on people for all of eternity. How can he be good? But C.S. Lewis has a really great quote. He says, "Hell's gates are locked from the inside." That as image bearers, God honors our choices that we make in this life. He honors the choice that we make to accept him or reject him. And so we are faced as image bearers, as volitional beings, with a volitional choice that God will honor. Do we choose to follow him? Do we choose to say, "Yes, I believe in the person and the work of Jesus. I give my life to him. I give my image back to him so that he can restore it, so that he can renew it again, so that he can make it new and unified with the image of Christ, who Jesus' perfect obedience is then placed onto you when you choose to follow Jesus." And so I know there are people listening to this who are part of our church that are wrestling with this decision right now. And I want to encourage you today, do not delay. The Bible says now, today is the day of salvation. Now is the time of repentance. Don't delay on this. Choose to follow Jesus. Give your broken image and all of its brokenness to a perfect Father who will lovingly unite your heart and the perfect obedience of Jesus, who will then begin to transform you over a lifetime. This is what it looks like to follow Jesus. This is what I want to compel you to do. Now, if you look back over the history of your life, and you can mark a moment of transition where you've said, "Yes, I give my life, I give my image back to God." Well, the invitation for you today is that you can be continually transformed into the image of Jesus as you engage in proximity and time with him. We talked about this last week, actually, but I want to put up for 2 Corinthians 3:18. Look with these beautiful words. "And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed," not have been transformed, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. My friends, if you are a follower of Jesus, you can choose to submit under the lordship of Jesus consistently over your life, or you can try to rebel against him. You have a choice, again, as an image bearer, even as a follower of Jesus. You can choose to receive his transformation in your life or not. And so what we talked about last week and what I want to continue to emphasize this week is proximity and time. So proximity to Jesus, that's reading the scriptures consistently, praying consistently, being in community, giving of yourself and your resources back to God, engaging in true worship, leading men specifically, leading your family well, discipling your wife, discipling your children, causing your family to thrive and flourish as God intended it to be. That's proximity with Jesus. And then also it's time. This isn't just a one-time thing. This is just a once-in-a-blue moon. But I'm talking about consistent, slow, steady faithfulness over the next 30, 40, 50 years of your life. That's what causes generational change. That's what transforms you into the image of Christ from one degree of glory to another. You can continue to express the glory of God in your life as you engage in proximity with Jesus, and you do that over a long period of time. And I want to encourage you to consider this today. Are you doing this consistently? Are you leading your family? Are you helping your children and your wife flourish? Are you helping your children and your husband flourish? Are you helping your boyfriend, girlfriend, those who are in your life as friends? Are you helping those around you flourish and thrive, or do you use them to meet some sort of need within you that Jesus has already met? And so I just want to encourage you, as you think about identity, as you think about your image as an image bearer, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus, if you see in your life that you've made a moment of decision towards Jesus, then my friends, engage with the transformation of Christ. Proximity and time equates to true, lasting, legacy-altering change. And I want to invite you into that. My friends, we're given infinite worth because we are stamped, we're imprinted with the image of Christ, image of God. We rebelled against God, and now we use our authority to bring evil into the world, but Jesus restores the image of God, and Jesus invites us to give our broken image back to God to be restored as well. Our main point is that every human being is made in the image of God, created with infinite value, and then invited to give our lives back to the ultimate image bearer, Jesus, to be restored and renewed. So how do we move forward in the wake of such beautiful theology juxtapositioned with such horrific tragedies and injustices in the world? How do we reconcile these two things? Because these two things don't seem to go together. What we talk about today, we're image bearers. We can give our lives back to God, but then we turn on the news, we look in the mirror, we see this brokenness that's pervasive, this injustice in the world. Where do we find our hope for today? Not just in the future, but where do we find our hope for today? And that's coming out of Jeremiah 33. And this is what I read yesterday at the steps of our county courthouse with many other pastors who were lamenting and moving forward, trying to move forward through this together, hugging our African American brothers and sisters who are feeling the weight and pain of this week in fresh and new ways. And I read these words on the county steps, the city steps of our city courthouse, and I want to read those to us today. In those days, and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell securely. And this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our righteousness. My friends, the righteous branch is Jesus. This was a prophecy foretold about the one who will come to set the world right again, that he will sit on a throne, and his kingdom and his authority will bring justice. His kingdom and his authority will bring righteousness. He will come to set the world right again. And I implore you today, give your life, give your image to Jesus. And if you have, be continuously transformed by being in proximity to him, and pray hard that others will do the same. Continue to seek justice, love, mercy. Pray for the family of George Floyd. Pray for the police officer who took his breath, knowing that one day the breath of life will fill our lungs when Jesus returns, and he will set the world right again. Every human being is made in the image of God, created with infinite value, and then invited to give our lives back to the ultimate image bearer, Jesus, to be restored and renewed. That's the invitation for you today. If you're joining us on a Sunday morning, I want to invite you to stay on wherever you're at, and at 11 o'clock Central Time, we're going to be doing a live Q&A where we will talk about the process of this past week. How do we process the events of this past week, and how do we render our lives back to God? What does that practically look like? We welcome your questions, your engagements. Again, we're going to be live on our website and Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, pretty much everything you can be on. We're going to be live there at 11 o'clock. And thank you guys so much for joining us. Take care.